From the Lean Enterprise Institute in Boston, this is the WLEI Podcast, where we share stories of people making the world better through lean thinking and practice. For more information about LEI, including how we can help you apply lean thinking, please visit lean.org.
Hello, my name is Lex Schroeder, and I'm glad to be joined today by Jim Morgan and Josh Howell for a conversation on lean product and process development. I should say this conversation will be most interesting to engineering leaders and truly any business leader in any industry who wants to take a more product-centric approach. A few words about our two guests. Jim Morgan is Senior Advisor of Lean Product and Process Development at the Lean Enterprise Institute, a former COO at Rivian, and a former product leader at Ford, where he contributed to Ford's historic product-led revitalization under then CEO Alan Mulally. Jim's book, that he co-authored with Jeff Liker, The Toyota Product Development System, Integrating People, Process, and Technology, turns 20 this year. So we want to take a look back at some of the important lessons from that book and explore these lessons for today. Josh Howell is President and Executive Team Leader of the Lean Enterprise Institute, where he is constantly exploring how lean thinking and practice can help leaders build high-performance learning organizations that create more value for customers. Welcome, Jim and Josh.
Thanks, Lex.
Thanks for being here. And Josh, as you know, I've invited you to co-host this conversation with me, which I think will be great. So Jim, you're going to get some questions from both of us, okay?
Looking forward to it.
Josh, why don't you kick us off?
Happy to do that. So hi, Jim. Good to see you. Lex, good to see you as well. So Jim, your book, which I've got here, Toyota Product Development System, has just turned 20. It's turning 20 here in the year 2026. Congratulations on that. So it's exciting because it was really, I think, the first book to detail Toyota's product development system, certainly in English for an American audience. So can you tell us a little bit about how the book came about? What prompted you to take on the research that is the foundation for the book?
Yeah, thank you. It's unbelievable that it's 20 years old already. The time has gone by so fast. So the motivation for it, I think Jim Womack captured it well, actually in the foreword of the book. He talked about the research at MIT that explored Toyota for the machine that changed the world. And they did indeed look across the entire enterprise, which is, one of the wonderful things about that book. And in fact, thanks largely to Taka Fujimoto, they included product development in that book. They also documented really well Toyota's performance in product development. They had shorter lead times, less engineering hours, less cost, higher quality than either their European or North American competitors. But they really only took a high-level look at how they did it. So they talked a little bit about the heavyweight product manager and some things like that, but they didn't look at the mechanics of what was going on at Toyota at the time in their product development area. And so I used that as an opportunity to go deeper. And thanks largely to John Shook and the University of Michigan, I received incredible access to Toyota, not only in terms of the depth of the research, but also they assigned some really important individuals to me like Yuichi Akamoto, Mike Masaki, and Hiro Segura, who acted as sort of teachers that guided me through the research to make sure I really understood what I was seeing and what I was talking to people about, both here and in Japan. And it turned into a bit of a learning adventure for me. It went on almost 3 years. It seemed like every corner I turned, I discovered something new, whether it was A3s or their Obeya system, or the Kento, the study period, or the set-based, or whatever. It just continued on. And when I look back at the book, considering that it was the research for it was in the late 90s, early 2000s, there's quite a diverse sort of group of things that we looked at in that research.
So you mentioned the foreword written by Jim Womack. I think it's in that foreword that he calls out when you approach this research project while pursuing your PhD at the University of Michigan. Prior to that, you had been in product development. I mean, you were a product development engineer, practitioner, coming into this research, which I think really helped make what you captured and shared through the book very practical. I'm curious, though, kind of looking back on it now, 20 years later, what would you say are its core lessons? And having been a practitioner prior to the research, what impact did it have on how you thought about and how you practiced and went about the work of product development?
So it fundamentally changed how I thought about product development. I mean, Toyota's system was just completely different than what their competitors were doing, far more effective as the data bears out. I think the first lesson I took away was just how critical product development, product and process development is to any enterprise, but was certainly central to what Toyota was doing at the time. In fact, I would say that organizations that are pursuing becoming a lean enterprise, if they're not working on product and process development, they are not going to get there. Period. End of story. In fact, I think it explains some of the disappointments that companies have, that they never quite match Toyota or their aspirations for a lean enterprise. And I think it's largely because they don't go back where value is defined. They continue to work their current production. But the other thing I think that really impacted me was that it was such a tightly linked system, right? And that it required engagement of the entire enterprise, right? It wasn't an engineering thing. It needed manufacturing and suppliers and marketing. It had to bring all of that together in order to be effective, right? Too many organizations think of product development as something that engineering sort of inflicts on them, and they have to kind of survive until the next launch. And that clearly wasn't the case at Toyota. And also, I think that it taught me how the various pieces of the system work together, right? Are mutually reinforcing, I think is the term I used in the book. So we discussed this a little bit earlier. When you think about the chief engineer and how the chief engineer spends the front end of the program really trying to understand the customer, the context, their competitors, really understanding how to create compelling value, right, in the next product for their customer. I think that lesson has been learned by a lot of different companies, but they do it in isolation, right? They say, okay, we're going to create a chief engineer and we're going to have them, go out and observe our customers and try to better understand this. But they neglect to engage the larger organization in this work, right? The hundreds of what Toyota called kentozu, or study drawings, that are generated based on the input from the chief engineer. They don't use K4 drawings to map out all of those study drawings into a subsystem, right? So you can look at the interfaces and how things work together. You sort of study the art of the possible based on this input from the chief engineer, right? And then you circulate that around the organization. Manufacturing looks at it, leadership looks at it, the chief engineer, of course. And it leads to a lot of dialogue. And the outcome of all that in this study period is the concept paper. And so the chief engineer uses all this input to create their vision for the next product, but they don't stop there. They also circulate that. They get everybody's input into that concept paper before it's finalized. And then that kicks off detailed design, right? That aligns the organization on what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it, and at a high level, how we're going to deliver it. And I think the way that system works together up front has everything to do with why Toyota has far less engineering changes later in the program, why they're able to get to market faster, why their costs are lower, and why their quality is higher, right? And why they can provide the underpinning for TPS in the plant, right? It's the way that system works together that makes it so powerful.
I love when you talk about it being a holistic system and then just really spelling out for people how important the sequencing of the work is. That's such an area of learning for me, and I love hearing you describe it. Now, after you completed this work, you were recruited by Ford, I think right after you completed this work, right? And you arrived at Ford at a really interesting time. I'm curious, how did these concepts around the Toyota product development system impact your work at Ford? How did you bring them to Ford, sort of respecting and understanding and working within that unique situational context? I'm really curious.
Yeah, it was really fortuitous. I arrived at Ford, maybe about a year before Mullally got there. Ford was in a incredibly difficult time, and Alan brought the realization, or drove the realization, that among the many problems that Ford had, the biggest problem they had was a product problem. They just weren't creating products that their customers loved and would buy. And that became Alan's mantra, is that we have to create products that our customers love and will pay for, right? If we're going to be able to survive, if we're going to be able to come out the other end of this difficulty that we're in the middle. And that drove just breakthrough products like the Fusion, like the Focus, like the Escape, the all-new Mustang, the all-aluminum F-150. I mean, there's so many products, great products that came out of that time frame that I think, drove the turnaround. But we didn't just copy any specific ideas from the Toyota research. We really tried to work from first principles down. What was appropriate for Ford? What was going to work in our environment? So we talked a lot about how to better understand our customer, how to align the organization and focus them in on this compelling value proposition, and how that would be most effective at Ford. And I think that's the biggest way that that research influenced us.
Thank you.
Can I chime in maybe with a follow-up question, Jim? Based on what you just said, I'm curious if you can recall maybe a specific product development practice that you discovered at Toyota that either didn't fit Ford and so kind of got set aside, or that in hindsight you can see how it got like really significantly changed or, modified to fit the situational context, as Lex put it.
So I think, for example, we'll go back to the study period again. We didn't specifically adopt a concept paper per se, right? But Dave Parasak, who I've talked about before, was just an outstanding chief engineer on the Mustang. And he created documentation that was a better fit at Ford. But he still circulated that around with various functional leaders. So he would sit and talk to me about, we need to reduce weight, we need to improve torsional stiffness, we have to, whatever. And, we want to figure out the best way to do that. And so we would have discussions with Body, which was my organization, and the chassis group to understand the various trade-offs and interfaces and design changes that we need within specific constraints, right? Budget constraints and manufacturing requirements and those sorts of things, which is another really important part of set base that people don't talk about very often, is that all that work is done within really strong constraints at Toyota, with manufacturing requirements and with quality requirements. We didn't have all of those. And so I think we probably did more experimentation, and we were building up things simultaneously. So we were moving to standard bill of process. We were moving to what we called PDPD, or process-driven product design. We were moving towards standard architecture. So we were creating those things as we went, a little bit building the airplane as we flew it, because we didn't have all of that infrastructure in place the way they've been evolving it at Toyota over so many years. The other thing I learned was it probably wasn't a great idea to run around Ford talking about Toyota this and Toyota that, because you're not going to be able to engage with people, because Ford was a really capable, super talented, proud group of people, and we needed to figure out our own way to go forward. I had the same experience at Rivian. We needed to develop the Rivian way of doing things. We didn't want some other version of Toyota or other version of Apple or anybody else.
Thank you for sharing more about that. I do have to ask, Jim, given all of the talk about how work is changing on pretty fundamental levels these days, are these ideas from the Toyota product development system, what we call lean product and process development, still relevant today for folks who are curious about that? I have my opinion, but you don't need to hear from me. I want to hear from you. What do you think?
So, of course, I'm going to say yes. But I think we can begin just by looking back at the original source of these ideas, by looking at Toyota. And there's a couple of things that I think are important to point out. Number one, in terms of their overall performance, in terms of the highest global sales, the highest levels of profitability, always in the top 3 or 4 for quality. I mean, their performance hasn't tailed off at all. And they're staying pretty consistent with their overall, sort of product and process development system. And it's still producing incredible results. I mean, there's no arguing with that. I think the other thing that's really impressive about Toyota is the way that they have navigated perhaps the most disruptive time in the auto industry, right? This, software-driven electrification, whatever. While many of their competitors, both in the US and in Europe, have just, wasted hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, sort of jerking from one solution to another solution during this time period. Toyota has been really steady. Listened to their customer, they've understood their customer, and they've created products that their customers really want. And so they've continued to sell them well. They've adapted with hybrid solutions, and now they have electric vehicles and whatever. But they've done it based on that whole idea of understanding their customer, being really thoughtful about stuff, which is really the core of what they're doing in product development. It's proven really successful for them. I think also they've continued to build on some of those foundational ideas like TNGA, right? The new Toyota Global Architecture, which I've written about in the past. They've continued to expand that, to apply it across all of their models, to reduce their costs, to increase their speed, to improve their quality. TNGA has been really powerful, and it's a core part of product development. And that has contributed directly to Area 35 initiative, which is the idea of reducing plant space by 35% across all of their major assembly plants by reducing product complexity, right? By getting rid of product complexity that isn't delivering value to their customers. And that is driven by the TNGA work that is started. Now, manufacturing has taken it forward and done a lot more with them. And that space that they're creating, they are now using as they start to look at electric vehicle manufacturing. And so the way their product development contributes to that is so powerful. And I think a lot of people don't realize it. But moving more broadly to other companies, I think the principles are important because so many companies, industries in fact, are so focused on technology alone, whether it's AI or whatever technology it might be. They think that the combination of money and technology is going to solve all of our product problems. And they're not looking at this system where, in fact, people are actually the most important part of product development, in my view. And I think they'll continue to be for some time because they provide the passion that drives great new products. Clearly, there's new technologies to harness, but it's still how the system works together to create products, and we miss that. And just one small example, if you look at the defense industry, I'm reading a lot about programs that are millions, if not billions of dollars over cost, that are years late, about fragile supply chain, about ossified procurement procedures, and they continue to think about strictly technological solutions to these problems or just throwing more money at it. And I don't believe that's going to solve it. They need to fundamentally rethink how they're developing these new products, think in terms of designing value streams, and adopt a lot of these core lessons. I think could be very powerful in an industry like that.
Should we talk about the, what'd you call it, Area 35, Project 35?
Yeah, Area 35.
Area 35 with Toyota. I don't know if you saw just the other day, we don't have to timestamp this conversation exactly, but the announcement from Toyota North America of $1 billion investment, $800,000 in Kentucky, $200,000 in Indiana. It's just, like hearing you describe Area 35 sort of on the reduction, waste elimination kind of cost side, and then simultaneously hearing them announce $1 billion investments here in manufacturing in the US. That's all part of a $10 billion commitment that they're making through 2029. This is just a tenth of that, I guess, that they recently announced. And what was interesting about it, if you saw some of the company news release, was the focus on that investment in their people. It was just like front and center as to why they're doing it. So cleverly, they're finding ways to reduce floor space requirements and stuff like that through a project like 35, Area 35, and then simultaneously making these really significant investments and thinking of it in terms of investing in their people. It's an incredible company. So my next question, Jim, you've touched upon this in the answer to Lex's last question, but why would you say these product and process principles and practices are important for really any organization? We've talked about Toyota. You talked a little bit about the relevance outside of Toyota. And maybe in your answer, you could specify a little bit, like what are some of the practices that you see companies tending to miss, even when they seek to emulate Toyota's product development system or put LPPD into practice?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I think any company could benefit by moving upstream, as we like to say, and working where value is defined, right? As opposed to sort of working after the fact on Kaizen or rework or whatever, which a lot of companies really get caught up in. We've joked from time to time, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between Kaizen and rework. But if they move upstream and start to sort of focus their continuous improvement efforts there, I think they'll get a lot more leverage and get much better results. In terms of specific things, I think what's really important, and this is a famous Al Ward quote, is to think about creating new value streams, not just products in isolation. And to do that kind of drives a lot of the other LPPD principles and practices, is if you're thinking about creating a new value stream, then you have to engage with service. You have to engage with manufacturing. You have to engage with marketing and your dealers and your suppliers, right? Every step along that value stream becomes really important in delivering value to your customer. And so if you just sort of change your perspective about what it is you're creating, that leads to lots of really good stuff. And I think if there is a common failure mode, it's sort of falling in love. We talked about this a little bit earlier, falling in love with some particular aspect of, LPPD, like the chief engineer or set-based or whatever it happens to be, and deciding that's going to solve your problem. It never does, and it causes a lot of frustration, is to think in terms of that system, right? How people and technology and process can all work together to change and improve your product development capability. I think the other thing I would mention is nearly every organization has a product. That product might be healthcare services, that product might be a car, it might be, some new way to provide, insurance security for somebody. But it still is your product, it's the value that you're creating. And again, by thinking more about how that value is defined in the beginning can have a really big impact on what you ultimately deliver to your customer. I guess one last thought, one other failure mode that I see is people who, especially organizations that have been successful in manufacturing with lean concepts, their idea is just to take those same specific practices upstream. Never works. It's always a disaster. And it even creates a lot of baggage for later on when you try to do something that's really helpful. So, while a lot of the value creating high level principles, first principles are similar, the specific practices are different, and it's important to understand that.
Thank you, Jim. I like how often you're using the word system, because I feel like systems thinking in general, right? Whether or not people have lean knowledge took off for a while, and then it goes away, and then it comes back again. So as we talk about systems thinking, I think we also have to talk about kind of culture change. And so much about lean and systems thinking has to do with what we call culture change. In the Toyota product development system, you talk about how a strong LPPD organization requires people to be on the same page really about 5 things. I love the way you break it down because it's really clear. People have to kind of have one shared way of working around organizational priorities, the way work gets done, the way people communicate with each other, the way problems are solved, and the way decisions are made. And along these lines, you remind us that the best way to do culture change and to actually start working differently is changing how people do their work, as opposed to telling people what to think, communicating new values through slogans and emails, and educating them in the new way. This stuck with me as a former editor and always editor and comms person. You can't just talk about it. You have to move to doing. And I think I learned that from John Shook. I've learned that from you, Josh, other people. On this point, what do you think stops business leaders from changing the way people do their work and just starting there? I personally think communications is critical, but not if you stop there. So what keeps people in talk mode instead of do mode? What do you recommend to help leaders maybe have the courage or the motivation to get people more in the doing versus the talking about it?
It's such a great question, and it's so fundamental to successful transformation. I think we all know that. I guess, first of all, my perspective on culture is that leaders get the culture they demonstrate and tolerate. And so the first thing they need to do is look in the mirror and think about how they can change the way they interact with the organization and reflect on how they can make improvements, because people hear a lot about initiatives, right? All the time. They get emails about this or that, or people put up signs or all that kind of stuff. I forget what the exact Deming quote is about slogans, but they don't help. In the end, they don't help. People watch where you spend your time, how you spend your time, what your priorities are. It matters, and leaders can have a big impact. And I never learned that lesson so well as I did at Ford when Mullally took over. And, he demonstrated those values every single day. And more importantly, he required that his leadership team did the same thing. And he was, I forget what his quote was exactly. Participation is not optional, right? Everybody is going to participate in the way we do this. So that's sort of the first step. And then I think you have to engage in a pilot. Just talking about this or doing what I call sheep dip training, right? Running everybody through an intro to LPBD training is not going to solve anything. I'm not saying that training is not valuable. It certainly is, but it's not sufficient. People learn best by doing. They learn best by experimenting. And so designing a well thought out, and I emphasize that well thought out experiment, a pilot, is the way to start learning. And as you start to change the way you work, people notice. People want to be part of it. You start to create pull in the organization because people start to talk about it all over the place and other people want to be part of that. That's one of the things I think is often underappreciated about the LPPD principles and practices is people like working this way. During this really traumatic time at Ford, our engagement survey results, which you can put however much faith you want to put into survey results, went from the low 40s to the high 80s.
Yeah,
during the same time period that we were working on more product development than we had in a long time. So there was a ton of stress, but it was focused energy on creating these new products.
I always think of Ted Lasso, I just can't help but thinking of sports. The way when you talk about it, I'm like, it's the same. It's a good basketball team or a good soccer team, It's like, how do we stretch those metaphors as far as they can go? But no, it's inspiring stuff. So thank you for that. Josh, did you have one final question for Jim before we close?
One final question. So Jim, curious sort of what you're up to today. How are you putting these ideas, these practices into your work these days?
Yeah, so this is probably the most exciting part is that the principles and practices are still alive and well with our learning group of companies. We work with some fantastic organizations where they learn from me, they learn from our fantastic coaches, but most importantly, they learn from each other. And we share, both our victories and our struggles and whatever openly across the companies. And the learning is just incredible. We're trying to create like our own lunar society. Most people I think are familiar with the lunar society from the Industrial Revolution, where scientists and industrialists and leading thinkers got together to share their work and their experiments and taught each other and helped sort of manage new technologies and contribute across industries, whether it was James Watt or Matthew Bolton or Joseph Wedgwood, the pottery guy. It's just, it's a great model, and we're trying to recreate that with our partners so that everybody cross industries can learn and grow and try experiments together.
Wonderful. Well, I'm really grateful to you both for this conversation. I want to keep talking, so that's always a good sign. I wish we could go on and on. For folks who haven't read the Toyota Product Development System, Jim's book that he authored with Jeff Leiker, you can get that at lean.org. Another fantastic book by Jim Morgan is Designing the Future. Also, you can get that at lean.org. I think there's so many lessons here for hardware and software organizations both, and there's so much more to think about and talk about together. So thank you both for this conversation. Please stay in touch with the Lean Enterprise Institute and the Design Brief, and thank everyone for tuning in.
Thanks, Lex.
Thanks, guys.